Elton John stopped playing. Not at the end of a song. Not between songs. Mid-chord, mid-breath, at the exact peak of a performance that had held 300 people completely motionless for 4 minutes, he lifted both hands from the keys, stood up slowly from the bench, and walked off his own stage. Jimmy Fallon's mouth was open. No words came out. He stood behind his desk with both hands at his sides, watching Elton John walk toward the back of the studio, and he could not speak, and he did not try. 300 people watched in absolute silence as the most famous pianist in the history of popular music walked toward a sound that only he could hear. It was a Wednesday night in November 2023. The Tonight Show starring Jimmy Fallon, Rockefeller Center, New York. Elton John was the musical guest, one of the final American television appearances of his Farewell Yellow Brick Road tour, the longest and highest-grossing concert tour in history. 300 people in that studio understood what they had been given: a last chance. Not a word used lightly, but the right word. Elton John had announced that this tour was the end. Not a pause, not a break. The end of live performance, forever, from a man who had spent 50 years giving everything he had to every room he had ever walked into. He walked onto that stage the way he always walks onto stages. Not slowly, not carefully, not with the measured pace of a man in his 70s who has said his goodbyes. He walked the way he has always walked, like the stage is a place he was made for and has been trying to get back to his entire life. The audience gave him a welcome that shook the walls of Studio 6B. He sat down at the piano. He adjusted the bench exactly once. And then he began to play. The song was Tiny Dancer. He had chosen it himself, without explanation, and no one on the production staff had asked for one. Some songs do not require explanation. He played the opening with his left hand only for the first 8 bars, the right hand resting in his lap. Just the melody, unadorned. The way you play something when you want people to remember why they loved it before the world told them to love it. The room was completely still. And then from somewhere near the back of the studio, near the entrance doors, a voice joined in. Not amplified. Not performative. Just singing. A woman's voice, older, slightly rough at the edges the way voices get when the years have used them fully, singing the words to Tiny Dancer with the particular ease of someone who has sung them 10,000 times in private and never once thought anyone was listening. Elton John's hands slowed, not stopped. Slowed, his head tilted slightly, the way a person tilts their head when they hear something they recognize from a very long time ago. His right hand moved to the keys and then stopped, suspended above them, not playing, just hovering. His eyes moved from the piano to the darkness beyond the stage lights. Jimmy Fallon leaned forward from behind his desk. He could see that something was happening that was not part of the show. His voice, when he found it, was barely above a whisper. "Elton? You all right?" Elton John did not answer. He stood up from the bench. Slowly, deliberately he stood, and he stepped around the piano bench, and he began to walk toward the back of the studio. The entire studio froze. The Roots had not been playing. It was a solo piano performance, but every member of the band went perfectly still in their places, watching. The floor director stopped mid-step. The cameraman on the dolly did not move the camera. Nobody in the production booth said a word. What was wrong? Was he ill? At 76 years old, on the final stretch of the most grueling farewell in the history of touring, was something happening that no one should be watching? The woman in the back had stopped singing. She had pressed herself against the wall beside the entrance doors, one hand over her mouth, eyes wide, not understanding. She had not meant to be heard. She had never meant to be heard. And then Elton John spoke. His voice was barely above a whisper, but the wireless microphone on his lapel caught it perfectly. One word. A name. Dorothy. 300 people held their breath. To understand what happened next, you need to understand what happened in the autumn of 1970. Elton John wasn't always Elton John, the icon, the legend. The man in the glasses who became synonymous with the word spectacle. In September 1970, Elton John was 23 years old and had been famous for approximately 3 weeks. His debut American performance at the Troubadour in West Hollywood had happened that August and had changed everything. The reviews had been the kind of reviews that don't happen very often. The kind that use words like extraordinary and once in a generation. And suddenly the name Elton John was attached to a kind of attention he had spent his entire life working toward and had not yet learned how to carry. He was booked on a national radio tour. 6 cities in 8 days, promotional appearances at radio stations, brief sets, handshakes, the machinery of early fame running at full speed. The 4th stop was Cleveland, Ohio, a radio station called MMS, a station that would later become one of the most important rock stations in the country, but was in 1970 still finding itself. Run by young people who believed passionately in music and had very little money and an enormous amount of conviction. Elton John arrived at the station on a Tuesday afternoon in late September with his manager and 1 piece of luggage and a persistent cold that had been following him since Los Angeles. The station had 1 piano. It was an upright, old, badly tuned, sitting in a back corridor that the station used for live acoustic sessions. The keys were yellowed. Several notes in the middle register stuck. It was, by any professional standard, an embarrassment of an instrument. Elton John sat down at it and played for 40 minutes straight. Not for the recording. Not for the promotional appearance. The promotional appearance had ended. He just played, alone in the back corridor, because he had not played a proper piano in 4 days, and his hands needed it the way some people need sleep. He did not know that anyone was listening. The corridor was supposed to be empty. It was not empty. Dorothy Marsh was 44 years old. She was the station's bookkeeper, not a music person by training, not someone who had come to double M's out of passion for rock and roll. She had come because it was a job that paid her rent and allowed her to take the bus from her apartment on Euclid Avenue every morning without depending on anyone. She had been at Whims for 2 years. She was quiet, efficient, almost invisible in the way that people who keep the financial records of places are often invisible, present, essential, unnoticed. She had not meant to stay late that Tuesday. But there was a discrepancy in the accounts receivable that she could not reconcile, and Dorothy Marsh was not the kind of person who went home with a discrepancy unresolved. So she was at her desk in the small office just off the back corridor at 7 o'clock in the evening when the piano started. She did not know who was playing. She did not go to look. She simply stopped what she was doing and listened. She had grown up with music the way children grow up with music in houses where there is not enough money for lessons, by hearing it everywhere and absorbing it without instruction. Her mother had sung. Her grandmother had sung. Dorothy herself had a voice that she had never done anything with because it had never occurred to her that a voice was something you did something with. You sang when you were alone. You sang when you were washing dishes or waiting for the bus or sitting in the particular quiet of a Tuesday evening in a radio station corridor when a young man you had never met was playing a badly tuned upright piano like it was the finest instrument in the world. She started singing along, quietly, not performing, not even consciously, just singing the way she always sang, without an audience, without a plan, because the music asked for it. Elton John stopped playing. He turned on the bench. In the doorway of the small office, clearly startled, clearly embarrassed, Dorothy Marsh had both hands pressed flat against the doorframe. "I'm sorry," she said. "I didn't know you could hear me." Elton John looked at her for a moment. Then he said, "Will you do that again?" She did. She stood in the doorway of the accounts office at W.M. Eames in Cleveland, Ohio, and she sang, and Elton John played the badly tuned upright piano, and they stayed in that corridor until almost 10 o'clock at night, going through every song he knew and several she knew that he didn't. She had a voice that he would describe. Years later, in the one private conversation in which he ever mentioned her name, as the most honest voice he had ever heard in his life. Not the most trained, not the most powerful, the most honest. The kind of voice that has never been taught to perform, and therefore has never learned to lie. He asked her about her life. She told him. He told her about his. The way you tell strangers things in certain rooms, in certain hours of the night, when the music has already done the work of making you honest. When he left Cleveland the next morning, he gave her a copy of his debut album. He wrote on the inside sleeve, in his handwriting for Dorothy, who reminded me what this is for. E. She kept it. She kept it on the shelf in her apartment on Euclid Avenue, and then in the house in Shaker Heights she moved to in 1978, after she married a man named Gerald, who worked for the city and loved her steadily and well. And then in the smaller apartment she moved back to in 2004 after Gerald passed, quietly and without warning, of a heart attack at 61. She kept it through every move, every change, every version of her life. She kept it because of the 12 words written on the inside sleeve, because no one had ever said that to her before, and no one had said it since. And she believed, in the way she believed most things, quietly, completely, without requiring confirmation that he had meant it. She had followed his career from that Tuesday evening forward, every album, every tour. She had seen him perform live 3 times over the decades, always from seats near the back, never trying to get closer than she had a right to get. When the Farewell Yellow Brick Road tour was announced, she read about it the way she read about most things, carefully, completely, and without illusion. She was 97 years old. She had stage 4 lung cancer. She had been told by her oncologist that she had perhaps 6 months, perhaps less, and that she should spend that time in whatever way made her feel that her life had been worth exactly what it had cost her. She thought about it for 2 weeks. Then she wrote a letter to Elton John's management company. She did not ask to meet him. She asked only for 2 tickets to the Tonight Show taping so that she could bring her granddaughter, who had never seen live television, and hear him play one last time. She did not mention the corridor in Cleveland. She did not mention the album sleeve. She did not mention that she had been singing his songs quietly to herself for 53 years. She signed the letter with her full name and her address in Shaker Heights, Ohio. Someone at the management company read it. They brought it to Elton John. He read it in his dressing room at Madison Square Garden, the night before the final New York show of the tour. He sat with it for a long time. Then, he asked his assistant to get him the contact information for the Tonight Show booking team. Behind the scenes, Elton John had made a decision that defied every producer's expectation. He had told the Tonight Show nothing about Dorothy Marsh. Not her name, not her history, not why she was being given seats in the back section of the studio with specific instructions that no one from the production staff was to approach her before the taping. He had arranged it through his own team, quietly, with the particular efficiency of someone who has spent 50 years making things happen backstage without press releases. What the producers knew was that Elton John had requested 2 guest passes for a personal family friend, and that she was elderly and should be made comfortable. What they did not know was that Elton John had spent the previous week thinking about a Tuesday night in Cleveland in 1970 and a woman in a doorway who had sung along with a badly tuned piano without knowing anyone could hear her. He had told his manager, "I want her there. I don't want her to know I arranged it. I want her to think she just got the tickets." His manager had asked why. Elton John had said, "Because that's how she came to me the first time. She wasn't trying to be noticed. I want her to be there the same way she was there then." He had not told anyone else. He had carried it into the studio that night, the way he carried most things, inside the music, waiting for the right moment to let it out. The right moment turned out to be the second verse of Tiny Dancer. Back in the studio now, the silence still holding. 300 people still not breathing. Elton John reached the back of the studio floor. He stopped in front of Dorothy Marsh. She was 97 years old, wearing a blue coat she had bought for the occasion. Her granddaughter's hand gripped in both of hers. She looked up at him with the expression of a person who genuinely did not know whether what was happening was real. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, his voice not quite steady, "You still sing it the same way." She said, her voice barely above a whisper, "I didn't think you could hear me." "I always heard you," he said. "I've been hearing you for 53 years. Her granddaughter made a sound that was not quite a word. Elton John reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and drew out an object. Small, rectangular, an album sleeve, not the album, just the sleeve, carefully preserved, slightly softened at the corners from decades of handling. He held it out to her. "You kept yours," he said. "I kept mine." Dorothy Marsh looked at the sleeve in his hands. On the back, in different handwriting, her handwriting, the handwriting of a 44-year-old bookkeeper in a radio station corridor on a Tuesday night in 1970, were 4 words that she had written and forgotten, and apparently he had not. She came to life. Her hand came up to her mouth. Her granddaughter said, "Grammy," and Dorothy Marsh shook her head once, the way you shake your head when you need a moment before you can speak. But this is the moment no one in the studio and no one watching at home ever saw coming. Elton John turned back toward the stage. He walked back across the studio floor, back to the piano, and he sat down. He did not look at Jimmy Fallon. He did not address the audience. He simply placed both hands on the keys. Then he turned his head toward the back of the studio and he said, loudly enough for the microphone to catch it, "Come on then." One more time. Like the corridor. Dorothy Marsh stood up from her seat. Her granddaughter tried to take her arm, and she waved her off gently. She stood, slowly, carefully, with the dignity of a woman who has been standing up her entire life under circumstances that did not make it easy. She stood, and she sang. And Elton John played Tiny Dancer on the Tonight Show stage for a 97-year-old bookkeeper from Cleveland who had sung along with him once in a corridor 53 years ago and had never stopped. Jimmy Fallon did not sit down. He stood behind his desk with both hands pressed flat on its surface, and he did not speak, and he did not try to speak. Because there are moments when the professional who has seen everything is simply, completely, and without performance, undone. Questlove picked up his sticks. He did not play the kit. He just held them, watching. The cameraman on the floor was crying. The director in the control booth did not cut to commercial. The producer standing at the monitor did not move, did not speak, did not do a single thing that her job required her to do. because her job, in that moment, required nothing. The room was already doing everything. 300 people were on their feet before the last note ended. Dorothy Marsh passed away in April 2024, 5 months after that November taping. She passed at home in Shaker Heights, with her granddaughter beside her and Elton John's music playing on the speaker her granddaughter had set up in the corner of the room. Her granddaughter kept the album sleeve. It sits on the bookshelf in her apartment in Cleveland now, beside a photograph taken by a Tonight Show crew member on the night of the taping, Dorothy Marsh standing at the back of Studio 6B, both hands at her sides, her face turned toward the stage, her mouth open, singing. Elton John was told she had passed while he was in England. He did not make a public statement. He did not post anything. He called her granddaughter on the telephone, and he said what he needed to say privately, the way he had always known Dorothy Marsh would have wanted things said. The 4 words she wrote on the back of his album sleeve in 1970 have never been made public. They belong to him. Some voices find you once, in a corridor, on a Tuesday night, when neither of you is ready, and spend the rest of your life reminding you what the music is for.